5th, 1915, at dawn, members of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps descended on Gallipoli Peninsula. By the time it was all over, 8,000 Australians and 2,700 New Zealanders lost their lives. Now 104 years later, on ANZAC Day, we remember them across the world, New Zealand, Australia, and right here in Trenton. Could you talk about ANZAC Day and what this represents today?
Absolutely. So I'm now an RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force officer, but I've only been here for 9 years. So before that I was an Australian Army officer, and ANZAC Day means a great deal to me personally. Fundamentally, ANZAC Day for Australia and New Zealand is the same as Canada's Remembrance Day. It equates exactly the same, but the ANZAC title is in its long form is the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, and it was a title given to the Australian and the New Zealand military forces that fought in World War I in the Dardanelles campaign along the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. It's a very, very special day, and like the Vimy battle is fundamentally important for nationhood culturally in Canada, the Dardanelles campaign was equally important for Australia and New Zealand. It was at that point that, generally speaking, the nations were both formed and matured. It became sort of sovereign in real terms. The commemoration is actually started at dawn in Australia and New Zealand, so it's dark when everyone gets up, and just like Remembrance Day in Canada, families will gather in the dark to celebrate as the sun comes up, and they do that because that was the time that the attack commenced in Gallipoli. So all of the soldiers were getting out of the big ships, getting into the smaller boats and heading towards the shore.
I'm an Australian-born Canadian. I came over here 67 years ago, and I've never had the opportunity to celebrate ANZAC Day in Australia. And last year, Chris Charland, the one that you just met, he came up with the idea that we had the Commonwealth Graves area here, had 2 Australian graves in that cemetery, so wouldn't it be a good idea if we celebrated ANZAC Day here? So it took on this year, and I was put in charge of the organization since I was Australian. I'm on the cemetery board here anyway, so it just fitted in to make it work.
And how many soldiers were lost in that campaign?
So there were about 500,000 Allied soldiers all up, and if memory serves, I think there were about 120,000 soldiers who were killed. So it's a pretty extraordinary number. The campaign lasted for 8 months. In combat terms, it was a difficult campaign because the Turkish forces, and there was about 350 of those, they actually held the high ground along the peninsula. And so the small boats, when the assault commenced, hit the beaches, but the fire, a very accurate fire, was pretty much at cliff level, directed right down onto the soldiers on the beaches as they attacked. So it was an extraordinarily difficult campaign, but it lasted for about 8 months before the soldiers were withdrawn from combat.
ANZAC Day is a very important part of Australian culture, in recognising a time when we became, I suppose, a country in our own right. And so following the ANZAC tradition is sort of seen as a way that we can honour that and honour the sacrifice that those have made. So especially being so far from home here for me, being able to participate in an ANZAC Day ceremony is very important to myself and my husband, who was able to come down with me as well.
All right, Todd, why does the Government of Ontario and Canada and Canadians need to keep recognizing this event?
Well, I think it's important to recognize our allies who have been shoulder to shoulder with us in battles past. It's hard to chart a course forward when you don't know where you've come from, and you have to certainly recognize and remember the battles over the years. And certainly I think obviously Australia and New Zealand are great allied friends, and this is a very important time for them. So I think it's great that the organization organizers here in Trenton have been able to commemorate their Remembrance Day, Anzac Day.
What struck you about today?
Well, I think first of all, just to see how many Aussies and Kiwis there are in the area, and just how important this is to them. It was compared to Vimy. It was their version of Vimy, and obviously I think we know what Vimy means to us here in Canada. It's a very emotional part of our past and one of the defining moments of our country, and ANZAC was the same type of event. Gallipoli with ANZAC was the same type of event, obviously, for those two countries. So it's the sacrifices that were made. Vimy was a tragic time, but a defining moment for Canada as well, and clearly Gallipoli was the same for New Zealand and Australia.
Anzac Day means a lot to me as an Australian because it always, as a young person, I grew up between the First World War and the Second World War. I finished grade school in 1940, just the beginning of the Second World War, and we learned all about the sacrifices of Anzac well before the other war began. And it carried over to, in Australia, every Anzac Day, it's far more of a remembrance than November the 11th. And each war that Australia has served in, they've served alongside the New Zealand servicemen. It's always moving when you pause for a minute to reflect on what others have done for Canada. And this one is for Australians and New Zealanders to reflect upon. There's a few Australians like myself, Colonel Elder, and 2 or 3 out in the audience today who were Australian. One of them, Damon Jones, has his boat in the harbor down in Trenton Harbor, and I asked him to come. So there are others in the community who were touched by the fact that we could put on a remembrance for Australians.